Your reaction to the president pulling the trigger last night?
Well, I think that for the first time in a long time, Americans were finally, we have a president now who took swift and certain action. He chose to act, and we saw the juxtaposition of a withering, dithering, whimpering president who couldn't make a decision, who drew a line in the sand and did nothing about it. And by the way, had that real deal with Russia and, Kerry putting, I think, that 2013 chemical weapons deal. They got rid of all their chemical weapons. That was and then, that was another success. And then Donald Trump comes in, and, he took swift, decisive action. And it made Americans proud. I think it made people all around the world proud. And as 400,000 Syrians have been killed, 5 million Syrians have been displaced, we finally have a man who knows the difference between right and wrong and good and evil, and it makes us proud, finally.
Geraldo?
My feeling is that this was a brilliant strike. It was precise. It was proportional. I'm very proud of how well it was carried out by our forces. My only hesitation was Assad is a barbaric savage who committed one of the most heinous acts we have ever seen captured on videotape. Right. If indeed he was guilty. That was my only hesitation.
You're wondering it may not have been the Syrian
I did, because it was so ill-conceived. Where were we back on Monday and Tuesday of this week? We had the President of the United States, we had the Secretary of State, we had the entire Trump administration suggesting that we could live with Bashar Assad, that getting rid of the Syrian dictator was no longer a U.S. priority.
So that emboldened him?
But here's the point. Not only is he barbaric, he is also profoundly stupid. Because here he had won the war. You have to look at it this way. He had finally gotten the United States and Russia on his side. All he had to do was continue to attack ISIS and al-Nusra and the other Sunni extremist groups. What does he do? If the president's correct, I have no reason to doubt him now. They've done the forensics on it. He does exactly the wrong thing. He aggravates. He commits this crime that makes everybody sick, that repulses the civilized world. He totally undoes everything that he achieved.
You said he was an idiot, so maybe that's why he did.
So, newsflash, dictators are also narcissists. I mean, you never know what they're going to do.
But why this
for all those people who say that, that the president emboldened him, the only person who emboldened him was Barack Obama. This president has made it very clear we're not going to tolerate actions like this. And, for people to criticize the president, and make no mistake, that is coming in terms of where do we go from here. I think that it was, as you say, Geraldo, strategic. It was precise, and I don't know that this necessarily involves us in anything further. And for all those people who said there was this bromance between Donald Trump and Putin, well, the bromance is over. Cut it out.
Hold on. Online, Jeanine, there are some suggesting that the fact that we called the Russians a half an hour early so they can move assets, that is proof that this administration is colluding with the Russians, believe it or not.
Do you know what that is proof of? It's proof that we don't want a world war. What we want is to stop Assad from using chemical weapons against the innocents, his own citizens.
I see it a little differently. I think that the fact that the Russians were notified and did nothing to interfere. Remember, we have cruise missiles. We love the Tomahawk. They're a precise weapon, terrific weapon. But the Soviets have ground-to-air missiles, that anti-missile missiles. They could have tried, at least, with their capability in Syria, to knock down those cruise missiles before they got to that air base.
Excellent point.
They did not. They were
so
evacuated.
What does that tell you?
They were evacuated from the base, the Russians. No Soviet, listen to me. No Russian aircraft were present. As far as I know, all the casualties so far, at least in the early assessment, are military. A Syrian general and some Syrian soldiers. No civilians involved. No Russians involved. That tells me that Putin secretly is saying to Donald Trump, all right, dude, it's your shot. My guy screwed up. You punish him. You did well. Proportional, precise, humane, You punish the savage crime against humanity. All right, now where do we go from here? Pick up the pieces.
But that you're right.
Yeah, and what that also said is, look, we don't want this to escalate. What we want is to identify that this is wrong. We're not going to tolerate it. This is inhumane, and that's the end of that. Okay, so it's not going to go out of control. It doesn't mean that they're in love with each other. It only means that this is something that we all agree with. It cannot be tolerated.
Here's the question. What do we do with the Sunni people in Syria going forward? What do we do? Do we create a safe zone within Syria? In other words, partition Syria, cut it in half. This is the Sunni half. This is the Shiite half.
If you do that, you have to assure them that it will be an official safe zone. And are we able to do that?
That's the hard part.
The disappointment I have, the strategic disappointment I have is last week when Donald Trump and Nikki Haley and Rex Tillerson were all saying we can live with Assad, then you saw the old Syria coming back together after this bloody war, 500,000 dead, 5 million displaced. Now I don't know where you go now. Now you have a shattered regime again. Are we going to let Assad continue in power? Well,
I think they're thinking through that calculation. You see it in the proportionality.
Yeah, I think they're not only thinking through it. I think they put a stake in the ground and they said, you know what? From here, everything is different. We can say we like you, we're going to tolerate you, but don't cross the line. He doesn't even have to articulate don't cross the line like the other guy did. All he has to say is there are certain things that will not be tolerated. His actions are swift, certain, and they're humane. And there's no question in my mind that he will, because he talked about safe zones, enforce them.
We'll see what happens. All right, Geraldo, thank you very much.
Thank you.
There is breaking news now on Fox News Channel. I'm Shepard Smith in New York. Fox News has now confirmed the United States military has launched dozens of Tomahawk missiles on sites in Syria. We got word this afternoon that the President of the United States was considering military action, that senior White House officials had met late last night and into this morning, that the Joint Chiefs of Staff had come together today. Tonight, the President is at Mar-a-Lago in Florida with the Chinese leader Xi Jinping, and while he was there and they were seated at the dinner table, the United States launched strikes on Syria. The effort here to knock out his ability to carry out the sort of airstrikes and sarin gas bomb that our military says struck on the Syrian people just days ago. Jennifer Griffin with the breaking news now live at the Pentagon. Jennifer?
Shepard, we've just learned that the U.S. has launched Tomahawk missiles at 2 separate air bases inside Syria. We understand that both of those locations were used to store chemical weapons. At least one of them, we have the name of one of them, Shariad. Shariad is the name of one of the bases. We understand that 43 Tomahawk missiles were launched from the USS Porter and USS Ross, both of which are in the eastern Mediterranean. It is our expectation that it will be mostly a Tomahawk missile strike tonight. The order was given from President Trump, who, of course, is at Mar-a-Lago tonight meeting with the Chinese president. He was briefed by his Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, as well as the National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, about the military plans for Syria. We also understand that the Joint Chiefs met in the tank late this afternoon to discuss these war plans. So as we know now, within the last few minutes, Tomahawk missiles, about approximately 43, have been fired at least one base inside Syria. Shepard?
The question is, Jennifer, what is the objective here? We know that we've taken these strikes. We know that part of the objective is to stop Syria's ability to launch this sort of strikes on its own people. But it's important to keep in mind that the Russian military is involved here as well. Have the Russians been notified?
Well, our understanding is that prior to the launch of these Tomahawks, that the Russians would have been given a call on the hotline to Moscow. That is a hotline that has been set up between the air base from which the U.S. conducts air operations in the Middle East. But again, right now it looks as though the U.S. Tomahawks have targeted at least one air base, possibly 2 locations. But there was talk at some point about sending overwhelming number of Tomahawks to multiple locations. It looks as though this is a very limited strike. A large number of Tomahawks, of course, 43 we're told, but it's not as though they have struck at multiple bases where these Russians would be located. In fact, the fact that they're not using airstrikes means that they did not have to necessarily take out the air defense systems, which are manned by Russians. We know that one of the concerns of Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, when he briefed the president, was that Russians could die in these Tomahawk strikes, given the fact that Russians are embedded on these bases with the Syrian military. So there's a great deal of concern about the proximity of U.S. forces. There are about 1,000 U.S. forces on the ground in Syria. There's 6,000 U.S. forces on the ground in Iraq, where we just learned last week from the top commander in Iraq that 100,000 Iranian troops are inside Iraq now, fighting very close to where the U.S. is advising the Iraqi army. So the potential for blowback for U.S. troops is very high, and there's a great deal of concern that the Syrian forces and their allies, the Iranians and the Russians who are fighting with them in Syria, could harm U.S. forces, which are also on the ground. So force protection, a very important part of this operation tonight. But it looks like a limited strike, 43 Tomahawk missiles targeting at least one, possibly two sites where chemical weapons were stored, about 120 miles from the site of that chemical weapon attack just 72 hours ago. We understand that these air bases are near the town of Homs in Syria. Shepard.
And joining us now with new information is our own Jennifer Griffin once again. Jennifer.
Sean, we've just gotten details from the Pentagon about those Tomahawk missiles that first landed at this Shariat Air Base at 8:45 p.m. Eastern tonight. We understand that the total number of Tomahawks fired was 59 Tomahawks. Those two U.S. destroyers, the USS Porter and USS Ross, could carry up to 70 missiles, we were told. They have now fired 59 at this one air base. We're also told that we should expect soon imagery, aftermath imagery from that air base at Shariat. That is near the town of Homs. It's about 120 miles from where the sarin gas attack occurred. We also expect imagery released by the Pentagon of the flight path of the the Syrian plane, the Sukhoi 24, that took off from the Shariat Air Base and flew and dropped the sarin gas bomb on that village 72 hours ago. The Pentagon to release that imagery soon. We're told that this was, the Pentagon is describing it as a proportional strike. We also are told that the Pentagon warned the Russians multiple times about this strike prior to the Tomahawks landing at this air base. They did so through a hotline that is established between what is known as the CAOC, the command center in the Middle East, the U.S. uses, and Latakia, which is the base used by Russia inside Syria. So there were multiple warnings to the Russians, commander to commander. Remember, General Joe Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, has met with his Russian counterpart recently in Turkey to establish and reestablish that hotline in the event of this kind of incident. We also are told, Sean, that there were Russian forces at this base of Shariat until recently. It's not clear whether they were still there tonight, but again, the U.S. military did warn through that hotline Russian forces that they were going to carry out this Tomahawk strike today. Sean?
Well, there were interesting comments by one Russian diplomat earlier this week saying that their support is not unconditional as it relates to Syria and Assad, said after the attack. You had a great description earlier of these 18-foot-long, 2 feet wide, 1,000-pound Tomahawk missiles and their slow path trajectory. Can you explain that again for those that are just joining us?
Yes, Sean. In fact, remember, the Tomahawk missile, a cruise missile, was first introduced during the Gulf War, the first Gulf War. And these are essentially flying telephone poles, if you will. They are fired from Navy destroyers, and they fly at about 500 miles per hour. So you can see them with the naked eye when they are flying. They're about 18 feet long, 2 feet wide, and you can imagine that if they were, once they were fired from the USS Porter and USS Ross, which were in the eastern Mediterranean, it could take up to 30, 45 minutes before they actually landed, because they can be fired from 1,000 miles away. So those destroyers could be quite some distance away. We also understand, Sean, that those two destroyers can carry up to 70 missiles. They've now fired 59. To resupply, we're told those Tomahawk missiles are stored at Suda Bay, which is a U.S. base in Crete, Greece. So those destroyers would have to resupply at this point in order to continue if there were any follow-on attacks. Now, we understand that this is a limited attack, a proportional attack, as the Pentagon said. It is designed to send a message to Bashar Assad, but also to the Russians, that the U.S. has said that they are willing to work with the Russians possibly to fight against ISIS. We have 1,000 U.S. troops on the ground in Syria preparing to help forces, Kurdish forces and other Syrian forces that the U.S. has trained to take Raqqa, which is the ISIS capital. So this was designed to send a message to Bashar Assad to stop using chemical weapons, to never use chemical weapons again. He was a signatory in 2013 to the chemical weapons treaty, suggesting he wouldn't. But another point, Sean, is that tonight there was a meeting at the UN Security Council that was indecisive. And in prior administrations, I believe that it would be safe to say that while the UN Security Council debated issues, a resolution on Syria and the chemical weapons attack, that in a White House or administration would have waited for those debates to finish. And tonight we were told that the U.S. wanted a vote on the resolution. Russia was blocking it. They expected Russia to block the resolution in the end, as they have 7 times in the past. And so this president did not wait. This president ordered a unilateral airstrike against Syria to send a stern message that chemical weapon attacks are not acceptable. Sean.
Obviously, there will be this is to prevent further mass casualties and attacks, and a message has been sent. Before I go to General Jack Keane, I wouldn't doubt that there are politicos out there that would make hay over the fact, knowing that at this particular air base in Syria, that Russian soldiers were there, that they were tipped off. Here we go. We've had 8 months of this Russian conspiracy, so I wouldn't be surprised if that happens. But that would be standard operating procedure, would it not?
I think in a civilized world, that is what one does, military to military. In fact, it's notable that the timing of the Tomahawk airstrikes would be at a time when there would be the fewest amount of people at that air base. So this is designed to send a signal, to send a message. It was not designed to inflict casualties per se. There are likely casualties at the base, but we'll be getting more details about that. But again, from a military perspective, it was the right thing to do to use this hotline that's been established between the two militaries to explain that we are not at war with Russia. We're not striking Russian soldiers, but we are, defending the right of the free world to basically say that the use of chemical weapons is not acceptable.
And also to add to that, Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, said clearly Russia has failed in its responsibility to deliver on their commitment to stop these kind of attacks. Either Russia has been complicit or simply incompetent on delivering its end of that agreement. So clearly strong statement and actions against Russia in this strike tonight. Jennifer Griffin, thank you. Stand by. We'll get back to you in just a few minutes.
From the foreign ministry says U.S. aids Saddam's use of CW against Iran in the 80s.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Then resorts to military force over bogus chemical weapons allegations, first in 2000 and now in Syria, 2003, and in Syria. Not even 2 decades after 9/11, U.S. military fighting on same side as Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Yemen and Syria. Time to stop the hype and the cover-ups. Mark Steyn, best-selling author, Fox News contributor as well, joins us right now. So that's interesting. The Iranians are saying we are a partner of ISIS.
Right. This is the confusion of it, and I think that's what was great about last night, in that how Syria shakes out in 3-5 years' time, we can't know, and we should be cautious about that after what's happened in Libya and Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere. But simply as a response to a provocation. I mean, basically, Assad said the world hasn't changed. For the last 8 years, I've been able to kill my own people and get away with it. They put dead babies on the world's TV screens, and Trump said, enough of this. And that's a change. That's a real Russian reset button. That's a reset button for the world.
Some people have said that the president took a different stance than folks anticipated. He's focused on ISIS in the Middle East, not necessarily issues like this. What does this tell you about how President Trump is going to approach the world?
Well, I think it shows that he responds to things. He's very nimble, and he's able to respond to things. The disgusting aspect of the last 8 years is that Obama mistook the sidelines for the moral high ground. So he would use all this lofty rhetoric about red lines, and he would stand there, and there'd be people killing each other, slaughtering each other, dead babies, and he'd stand there with his hand on his hip giving a speech, and he stripped words of their meaning. And Trump isn't as articulate, he isn't as polished, but his words have meaning. And to do that while he's having dinner with the Chinese, I mean, you said, did he tell him over the salad bowl? As I understand it, he told him over the creme brulee or the tiramisu. How cool is that, to actually make the Chinese Politburo sit through a night of American targeted bombing?
That's right.
Do you consider this a victory for him?
Oh yes, I think so. I mean, I don't want to be, because I think he's accomplished certain things. He sent a message to the Chinese as they're sitting across the dinner table from him. He sent a message to Putin, and thereby, incidentally, also made all this stupid investigations that the Senate and the House are chasing their tails in look absolutely ridiculous. You know, he's picked a fight with Putin at a time when Congress has spent and Susan Rice has spent a year investigating whether he's Putin's stooge. How stupid do they look?
Well, hold on a second, Mark, because there's some online who are suggesting the reason we called the Russians a half an hour early was to give them a heads up to move their military and their people and their assets, was because we're colluding. This administration still colluding with the Russians. That's why we gave them a 30-minute notice.
I don't think so. And you know that, Pete. I mean, the most effective move that's happened in the Middle East in the last couple of years is that Assad was supposed to be dead. History. He was gone. He was out. And Putin stepped in, put him back on his throne. Along with Iran. And basically made Russia a player again in the Middle East. And
just as his puppet.
Yeah, just as his puppet. And Trump has basically said, I don't care. I don't care if he's your puppet. If he's killing kids, he's not going to do it on my watch.
So, Mark, how are foreign capitals, especially our enemies, Moscow, elsewhere, how they're waking up this morning? Obviously, it's already midday over there. What's their calculation, their next step?
Well, I think they understand that this is really last night was inauguration day, that America is back in the world. Now, not ineffectively. I mean, what we have to be careful about here is whether the tactical ruthlessness of last night is matched with strategic clarity, which hasn't been the case in Afghanistan and Iraq. But accepting that Trump doesn't want to get mired in pointless civil wars, I think this keeps America's enemies on its toes and trying to figure out what it is they have to do.
Mark, the Turkish deputy prime minister said this is a positive, but it should be completed. I guess insinuating that it's not completed yet. No. What do we need to do to complete it?
Well, I think this is where, of course, like everything in the Middle East, it all gets incredibly complicated. In Libya, America made things worse, catastrophically worse. And we do not want to implode another regime. I'm not sure that Syria can be preserved, and I think what you probably need is some kind of Sunni statelet on the Syria-Iraq border, but preserving essentially Assad structures without this horrible butcher, barbarous family, they should be gone. He was an ophthalmologist. Yeah. I can't even say.
The eye doctor.
Meanwhile,
an eye doctor. That's in American.
Right.
In London, and I think, hereditary dictatorships are the worst on the planet. That's true in North Korea. It's true in Syria. I'm not a believer in hereditary dictatorships.
Most ophthalmologists don't put sarin gas in their citizens' eyes.
Most don't.
No.
Do you think there's been some confusion on the part of Mr. Assad over there? Because I think it was last week, our Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, said, well, it looks like Assad's here to stay.
Right.
Donald Trump, when he was out campaigning as president, said, you know, I don't know if we get involved in Syria. But 77 days into his administration, President Trump said, you know what? I'm flexible, and I've got to change my point of view.
Well, I also don't think he's a cynical man. I believe he was genuinely moved by those pictures of dead babies and dead children. I think he takes that kind of thing seriously. And I do believe that one of the ugly features of the modern world is that we can now see everything that's going on, and yet we normalize these men so that this butcher's ambassador is going to be eating in swank New York restaurants today, the guy at the UN, as if he's no different from the Swedish ambassador or the Slovene ambassador. And that's got to stop. And it doesn't mean you've got to go and get mired in Syrian nation building, but it does mean that if you're just some little rinky-dink, no-account dictator with 6 air bases, and you catch our eye for the wrong reason, we'll take out those air bases.
So what does Nikki Haley need to say to those ambassadors?
Well, I think Nikki Haley should stop. I think, generally speaking, the civilized world should stop normalizing people. And I put Putin in that camp, too. This is a way of saying to Putin, you want to have dinner with this guy, you want to treat Assad as if he's no different from the Prime Minister of Norway. There's a price to be paid for that.
It's a world where moral relativism is pervasive across every spectrum. And you're saying you just got to stop that and call a spade when you're a tin-pot big.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean you spend 15 years running around another Afghanistan, but it does mean you say, we're responsible for 40% of the world's military spending. We're not going to let a pipsqueak put dead children all over the TV screens of the world without consequences.
All right. Mark Steyn, thank you very much. Great to have you in the studio today.
Thank you.
Joining us now live from Washington is General Jeanine. General, militarily, this is a very big message that should be heard well beyond Syria tonight. What's your reaction to that?
Well, definitely. Particularly it's a major setback for Russia. Listen, they've enabled this regime. They have used their penetrating bombs to bomb underground hospitals. That's a war crime. They have largely conducted airstrikes against the Syrian people themselves, just like the Assad regime has been doing. And the fact of the matter is that they vetoed 7 UN resolutions where the UN has tried to assign accountability to the Assad regime for this kind of criminal behavior. Setback for Putin here, for sure. And the Iranians as well, but the Iranians don't care. Putin cares a little bit more about his image than the Iranians did. Other factor is we know, based on the 3 visits from Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Jordan, that President Trump has absolutely revitalized the historical and traditional relationship that the United States has had from President Roosevelt up until President Obama. He has revitalized that relationship. And I'm convinced now that he will get incredible cooperation out of the Sunni Arabs. The other thing, he sent a loud message to the Iranians in the first month of his administration that I am not going to tolerate your trampling on the interest of the Middle East and taking advantage of using your proxies to do that and also developing ballistic missiles. I'm going to stand in your way from accomplishing that. This is an incredible message that should have been sent many years ago by the Obama administration. Crossing the chemical red line in 2013 was not just about dealing with retribution for a heinous act. It was taking advantage, Sean, of the opportunity to destroy the entire Assad air power, which would have shifted the momentum against the regime and likely would have brought it down. We don't know that for a fact, but it was a likely possibility.
General, let's get your thoughts on the world reaction tonight. North Korea is watching tonight. The Iranians are watching tonight. The Russians that, as Rex Tillerson said, have been so ineffective and maybe even complicit earlier today, they are watching tonight. What is the message? How is this going to be received that America's back after 7 years of war crimes and death and misery and the use of these weapons, that it will no longer be tolerated, that the goal of this is to prevent any further mass casualty of civilians, that will now be non-negotiable with the United States of America?
Well, I think the president has been sending some messages since his inauguration, and I think the way the world reads him is certainly, there's all the campaign rhetoric, to be sure, and some of it was not predictable in terms of what his actions would be as president. But I think when they look at him, they see a strong, decisive leader who has had success in leadership, and he sort of does what he says. And now we see this act taking place where he said this is a heinous act and I'm not going to tolerate it. I'm going to act on behalf of humankind and do something about it. He's sending a message to the Chinese. He's telling the Chinese that, listen, the North Koreans are trying to weaponize intercontinental ballistic missiles, and the rhetoric is they will use them against my country and my people. Don't push me into a corner where I have to use a military option to deal with them. That would be horrific. That would mean war on the Korean Peninsula. But in the same time, I cannot permit them to launch a missile against the United States. I think he'll get the Chinese attention for sure as a result of that.
That's a good point.
It's not rhetoric. We've had rhetoric for 8 years with passivity and no action. Now he's taken a very limited action, but it sends an incredibly strong message to our adversaries in the world who are paying attention. Believe me, Iran, China, Russia paying attention.
North Korea, Russia,
and certainly the rogue state of North Korea. They are all paying attention to this. Now, listen, it's not a panacea for all of our problems, to be sure. Not one military strike on one evening is going to change the world. But it is going to tell the world that we have a decisive president who is going to act on behalf of U.S. national interest and the interest of our allies when he believes that's at stake. And that is an unequivocally loud, clear message.
All right, and thank you, John. We'll get back to you later in the hour. Thanks.
Bring in General Anthony Taydod, retired bridge gator, general and author of the new book, Besieged. General, good to have you with us this morning.
Great to be with you, Abby.
All right,
Thank you.
You just heard that timeline from Griff Jenkins. I mean, it really is pretty incredible when you think about how many times Syria has gotten away with using chemical weapons without us responding in any way. What do you make of these airstrikes?
Well, the most jarring thing to me, Abby, is that President Obama saw similar pictures in 2013 and did nothing about it. And he passed it off to Secretary Kerry, who then worked with the Russians, who are completely unreliable in every sense of the word, to handle the chemical weapons in Syria, and then he went and played golf, and so this blood is directly on President Obama's hands because he did nothing about it, and he saw the same pictures that President Trump saw. So now we have decisive action from the Sixth Fleet in the Mediterranean. This is what we call flexible deterrent options. So we can do a show of force, we can do a surgical strike with cruise missiles, and we can do much more than that. And I think, a lot of the discussion is what comes next. Well, I think what comes next is President Trump saying, how do you like me now? And don't do this anymore, or you're going to get more of this. And, we talk about regime change. That's not something I think we want at this moment. I think it's something eventually that politically and diplomatically that we should go after. But right now, what we need to do, we cannot let use of weapons of mass destruction stand anywhere in the world because they're a threat to everybody.
Yeah, you see the images. 28 children killed because of these latest chemical weapons attacks. I mean, it's horrific, and it is so hard to see, and it makes you, in that moment, grateful that President Trump did something to respond this time. How do you think the world will respond to this? Because there are so many factors at play here. The timing is so interesting. I mean, President Trump had dinner last night with President Xi Jinping of China. You've got Iran at play. You've got, obviously, Syria. You've got Russia. How do you see all of this playing out?
Well, it was previously mentioned the connection between China and North Korea. I think it sends a strong message to North Korea that this is a president, President Trump, will take action if the vital interests of the United States are threatened. And that's what America First is all about. It's a realist foreign policy that says, I'm going to take care of my people and my country first and foremost. And the threat of weapons of mass destruction is one of those things that you cannot let stand. And the fact that President Obama let it stand, everybody who supports President Obama ought to take a real hard look in the mirror today and take a look at those pictures and say, you know, Obama saw those pictures and did nothing. And so today, we've got a president who saw those pictures and did something. And he understands that threat can come to our shores. And, you know, Syria is a failed state, and we got to get in there. But when you look at Iran, they're a puppet of Iran, and they're also a puppet of Russia. And so we've got some unpacking to do. It's three-dimensional chess inside of Syria right now, but it sends a strong signal around the world that we've got a president who's going to do what he says he's going to do.
Something that many people are concerned about, General, is ISIS. What does this mean for ISIS? We were talking to Connor Powell, our correspondent over there on the ground in Syria, and he said we've seen in the past that ISIS has taken advantage of a vacuum when that happens. Will they do that this time around? Is that something we should be concerned about?
Well, you know, I think that the vacuum, Syria, the Syrian government has been tacitly supporting ISIS by buying oil from them, by setting up a mobile carrier service for them, and other economic and support mechanisms. So I think this also helps get at the ISIS problem a little bit, and it sends a strong signal to ISIS that we're not going to play, and that this president is a president who can keep a secret. He's not using military forces for his own public relations image, as President Obama did. He had a great poker face yesterday when asked about it, and he said, yeah, you know, who knows what's going to happen. And so I think ISIS is on notice here. That doesn't mean they're going to stop fighting. They'll probably continue to fight, but what's happened over the last 2 to 3 months has been President Trump has been challenged by North Korea, by Iran, by Russia, and by ISIS, and a soft revolution within our country. And so everybody who's supporting the Democratic candidate, Hillary Clinton and President Obama, they ought to take a hard look in the mirror and say, you know, we got the right guy in here because this world is in trouble right now.
General, just quickly, about 45 seconds left here. What advice do you have for President Trump as this is maybe just beginning? We may see response from Bashar al-Assad, a response from Vladimir Putin. What advice do you have for the president?
I think he's got a kit of flexible deterrent options in there. The whole idea is to deter the use of chemical weapons, and now what he needs is a plan to go in there with a coalition, and coalitions are only as good as the leader of that coalition, and that's why they haven't worked in the past, because we have not been leading. And so President Trump is in a position to lead right now, and I believe he will. I would recommend to him to get a coalition in there to now ferret out all these chemical weapons and to get the UN to dispose of them instead of Russia. And you know, if we need to put our own troops on the ground to do that, then we should. But we cannot let weapons of mass destruction stand.
Yeah, I think a lot of people can wrap their head around that one. General Anthony Tata, thanks for being with us this morning. Really appreciate your insight.
Thank you, Abby.
Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, meanwhile, said earlier today that the U.S. is moving toward removing the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad from power. Here's what he said.
We are considering an appropriate response for this chemical weapons attack, which violates all previous UN resolutions, violates international norms and long-held agreements between parties, including the Syrian regime, the Russian government, and all other members of the UN Security Council. It's a serious matter. It requires a serious response.
What to make of these very rapid developments? Congressman Scott Taylor represents the state of Virginia. He's also a former Navy SEAL, and he joins us right here on the set. Congressman, thanks a lot for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Tucker.
So the justification for this is that the Syrian government, the Assad government, used chemical weapons against civilians in Syria. And we're certain that's true. And if it's true, why do you think that Bashar al-Assad, who's been in power for 6 years during this war and withstood all these sanctions, what would be in his interest in doing that?
It's a good question. I mean, look, we know that the chemical weapons are there. They're supposed to be removed under agreement that under the last administration, and Russia as well too. So regardless of folks are trying to figure out who exactly did it, whether it was Assad ordered it himself or who in his government did, the chemical weapons were not supposed to be there, and he bears responsibility for it, and so does Russia.
So what would be the objective of this exactly? Purely humanitarian, to express our displeasure at his use of chemical weapons, or is there a strategic reason that would help the United States?
Well, there's certainly a strategic reason, but let me first say that I think that the world's watching right now. The world is watching for the United States to lead, and whether that is in airstrikes or whether that is simply saying we're going to bring a coalition to the will and to put an end to this war, and hopefully out of this tragic, horrific incident, hopefully that's what the end state that happens is that we actually bring a coalition to the willing to put an end of the suffering that's happening in Syria right now.
And we're certain that by attacking government installations in Syria, we're going to, quote, put an end to the suffering?
Well, that's not what I'm certain about. It's a good question. What I would say to you is, the president has the ability, as you very well know, we have troops that are operating both in the area. The border between Iraq and Syria is disintegrated. There is no border there. Right. We have folks that are operating there. It does worry me that we have a lot of great powers, Turkey, Israel, Russia, us, Iran, Hezbollah is there, of course, all playing in the same battle space. So I am worried about deconfliction and greater escalation of conflict. And I would say to you, the president has the power to do a short term, but it's important to say that this is the second administration that's operating off of a use of authorization of military force from a third administration 16 years ago. Right. So that being said, I think it is important that the American people, via the representatives in Congress, take a debate up and figure out where we want to go in Congress and what we want to, where we want to move as a nation. But I do think the world is watching.
That's exactly what doesn't seem to be happening. So this is less than 72 hours ago that we got news of this chemical weapons attack. I don't think any American inspectors, at least publicly, have been to the site itself. We say that we know it was the government of Assad. Maybe it was the government of Assad. But there's a lot we don't know, including how Russia might react to all of this. Does it seem a little premature to start launching strikes so shortly after this event?
That's an excellent question. Look, we don't know all the intelligence. We don't know what the intelligence of the president is seeing. We don't know about the back channels or the communications that are going on between these great powers, of course, as well. As I told you, I'm very worried about Syria itself escalating to a bigger conflict because of the potential for flashpoint with all these great powers playing in the same sandbox and perhaps not the ability to deconflict. I imagine some of that is going on. That being said, it does worry me, and I think from a long-term standpoint, it's important that Congress take this up as a debate and figure out what we're going to do in terms of use of authorization of military force or not.
Again, that's emphatically not happening. That's the opposite of what's happening right now, apparently. So Senator John McCain of Arizona was asked today, should we do this, and what happens if it leads to a wider war with Russia? And I'm quoting him precisely when he said, I don't give a damn. If we get into war with Russia, he said, in effect, we will win. We are the superior military power. Do you think that that's a wise course to invite war with Russia over this?
With all due respect to Senator McCain, who's been around a lot longer than I have, of course, I disagree with him on that point. I think it's important that we try to that we again lead. The world's watching us right now for us to lead, and I think that we can lead and bring Russia with us to try to figure out a solution for the problem that's in Syria. I think that. Look, do I think we can beat Russia in a war? I do, absolutely. But is that in our best interest? No, it's not. I don't think it is. I don't think it's in our best interest. I don't think it's in Russia's. And I don't think it's in the world's best interest for that to happen. So with all due respect to Senator McCain, I just disagree with him.
It seems deranged. Do you think that's a widespread view in the United States Senate? That we should have a war with Russia?
I don't think that's a widespread view.
So do you think, given that we have been told to expect the possibility, at least, of airstrikes imminently, that before launching any such strikes, the U.S. government would coordinate those with Russia, given that there are quite a few Russian personnel and materiel in Syria right now?
Well, as I said, I think it's very important to deconflict. You've seen Israel, for example, has operated in there as well, too, and they've seen Russian-made anti-aircraft missiles being pushed towards Hezbollah. And they have deconflicted with Russia when they've gone in to destroy those things. I think that's necessary for us to do the same thing. But like I said, I think that attack, the whole world now is watching this president, and this is a very different president from the last one. So I think if the president, which he has not done yet, which I think is the smart thing, to not say what we're going to do. You have seen, and I know that you've seen the reports of preparations for a potential strike. You've seen that. I don't know. I don't have any information if he's going to do that. But I will tell you, I believe that this president, if he says he's going to do it, he will do it. And that being said, I think that the other great powers, such as Russia, believe the same thing. So I think that in itself could potentially bring Russia to the table to try to find a solution in Syria.
So the justification for this, of course, was the horrifying footage and photographs of the children who were killed by this apparent sarin gas attack, if in fact that's what it was. But they were killed. And the American ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, said yesterday, 2 days ago, how many more children need to die before the United States steps in. A, do you think it's our obligation to stop the killing in Syria? And B, do you think fewer children will die? Do you think children will stop dying if we do this?
I do think that children will stop dying if we do this. I do believe that we have an obligation as a world to deal with the problem that's in Syria. As I said to you before, Syria in itself, to me, is probably the most dangerous powder keg that's going right now in the world, because it could spiral out of control very quickly, and then a lot more children would die. I was impressed by Nikki Haley. I think she was strong, she was tough, she was direct with the Russians, that they bear some of the responsibility, if not directly, then indirectly, and I back her up 100% with it.
One last question for you, Congressman. Everyone I've spoken to who's been in Syria recently, and been a couple of them, has said that the Assad government, for good or ill, is winning the war against the various insurgencies and is restoring its control over the country, which is to say the country is becoming more stable, maybe not more morally pure, but more stable. Why is that bad?
It's not bad to stabilize a country. It's actually important that we do that. And if you had asked me this question about 3 or 4 days ago, I would tell you that a lot of actors over there, a lot of great powers, were viewing Assad as at least a short-term solution, but not a long-term one, but at least a short-term one. That's all changed now. That's all changed because of the things that have happened on the ground.
Right. Which might make you pretty suspicious of those things. You would, if you were a cynic, not that I am.
I think you should be. I think
yes, I think I should be too.
Which is why I told you that I think that Congress should debate this.
Yes, I think so too. Congressman, great to see you tonight.
Absolutely.
For the third major story tonight, the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee is stepping aside from that panel's investigation into alleged ties between the Trump campaign and Russian officials. Correspondent Peter Ducey tells us why the change, who's running point now, and for how long.
There's a new Republican in charge of the House Intel Committee's Russia probe, Texas Congressman Mike Conaway, who found out Chairman Devin Nunes was going to step down when the phone rang last night.
His decision. He called me in, asked me to do it, and I said yes.
The announcement that Nunes was stepping aside came just minutes before the House Ethics Committee made an announcement of its own. Quote, the committee is aware of public allegations that Representative Devin Nunes may have made unauthorized disclosures of classified information in violation of House rules, law, regulations, or other standards of conduct. A lawyer for Nunes has already asked the Ethics Committee what evidence it has on him, but he's already narrowed down who he thinks complained. The California congressman says, quote, several left-wing activist groups have filed accusations against me with the Office of Congressional Ethics. The charges are entirely false and politically motivated and are being leveled just as the American people are beginning to learn the truth about the improper unmasking of the identities of U.S. citizens and other abuses of power. Nunes has been under scrutiny ever since he says a source showed him documents proving the Obama administration inappropriately signed off on the unmasking of Trump transition officials named in intel reports, documents his Russia probe replacement still hasn't seen. Have you seen the documents?
Not yet.
So you have not seen what it was?
Not since last night, no.
On Air Force One, President Trump talked about Nunes stepping aside.
I think he did that maybe for his own reason. He's a high-quality person.
Speaker of the House Paul Ryan doesn't think Nunes did anything wrong either.
So he wants to go clear himself while this investigation continues on without any kinds of distractions.
Even the top Democrat on the House Intel Committee praised Nunes today.
I'm sure it was a very difficult decision for him, but as he mentioned, I think it is in the best interest of the investigation.
As for what happens next, Congressman Conaway knows the next few months will be a challenge. What is your biggest concern as you take over this Russia Intel probe?
It's a lot of the scope is big. I mean, there are a lot of things going on, a lot of issues to be get to the bottom of.
Another big question tonight, is President Obama's former national security advisor Susan Rice going to be called to testify to answer to allegations that she unmasked the identities of Trump transition officials who appeared in intel reports for political purposes? Chairman Conaway wouldn't say if an invitation has been extended because he doesn't want to conduct committee business in the press. Brett.
Peter Ducey live on Capitol Hill. Peter, thank you.
No child of God should suffer such horror. And the president goes on to say, tonight I call on all civilized nations to join us in seeking the end of the slaughter and the bloodshed in Syria. Joining us now, live from Washington, is Senator Marco Rubio, who put out a supportive statement earlier tonight. Senator, your reaction to the president's actions here?
It was the right decision for a number of reasons. Number one, Assad had signed an agreement not to have chemical weapons. It was an agreement that the Russians and the United States were signatories to and a part of. They also signed the convention not to have weapons, and then they had a UN Security Council and a resolution on them as well. They have violated that, and that therefore there needed to be a consequence for it. Someone needs to enforce it. Russia's not going to enforce it. They're helping them. And therefore, that was number one. Number two, I think it's important to remember there are hundreds of Americans stationed in that region, very near to that place, and this guy's using sarin gas. It could ultimately be used against our own troops, and that cannot be allowed to stand. So it is in our national security interest. Number three, I hear a lot of talk, and I'm not saying you, but others, about, oh, this is a symbol or a message. It certainly has a messaging component. But he struck a military base that was used not just for chemical attacks, but potentially for future chemical attacks. And so it had a strategic objective that was very clear, and he dedicated the significant resources, 59 Tomahawk missiles, to destroying a particular air base. That is how you conduct military attacks. You have an objective, and you dedicate the resources to achieve it, and the armed forces of the United States, as they always do, did so. So the president had the legal authority to act, the moral authority to act, and quite frankly, the military strategy to be successful at it. It was the right decision that he made.
Yeah, I agree. The Pentagon just put out a statement, Senator. Russian forces were notified in advance of the strike using the established deconfliction line. This is something you know a lot about. Can you explain it?
Well, obviously, there are military-to-military contacts in the region with the Russians and others, and the reason why you do that is not some conspiracy. You know, I've been as tough on all that as anybody else. It's simply because their objective was not to kill anybody. Their objective was to destroy a facility so that they couldn't fight the planes to conduct more attacks. The way that they are using these chemical weapons is they're dropping them from their airplanes, and that is the airfield that they're flying those attacks from. They've conducted chlorine bomb attacks from that airfield, and they conducted the sarin attack from that airfield. And so the objective of this mission was not to kill Russians. It was to destroy an air base so Assad could not use it in the future. And so that is an appropriate thing to do. It has nothing to do with, you know, some sort of nefarious conspiracy theory that some might come up with. It has to do
we'll save
with
that.
Military involved.
Senator, we'll save the conspiracy theories for the mainstream media because they live and die by them. 8 months of conspiracies with no evidence. But on a serious note, Senator, whenever military action is taken, you have to prepare for potential consequences or the reaction of others. In anticipation of this, what would you say that our military is preparing for at this very moment in terms of Syria's reaction and in terms of Russia's reaction?
Well, first is the potential targeting of our troops in Iraq and in Syria. That's number one. That's the first thing I would anticipate. The other is some sort of Russian stepping up their air campaign on the ground against elements on the ground. Of course, they've done a significant amount already. But I also think that the consequences of not acting would have been very severe. Not acting would have probably led to more chemical attacks. They could have inadvertently at some point even targeted American troops or American interests in the region with sarin gas. The other point that I would make with regards to all of this and what was going on there was someone, at the end of the day, what is the point of all these resolutions and all these agreements that the United States is signing on to? Because people forget, but back in 2013, 2014, the Russians and the United States entered into this agreement that the Syrians were not going to have chemical weapons. They have chemical weapons. They've been using chlorine bombs, and now they use sarin again. And this is nothing but legally an effort to enforce those requirements. The Russians aren't going to enforce it. They're helping them. This was important tonight to be done. And can I say one more thing, Sean? I think it was evident yesterday. Anybody who saw that press conference, the president standing next to the King of Jordan, he was deeply moved by what he saw and what he was exposed to. And I think that's
tonight as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that is something that can't be ignored. I said that earlier today. He clearly was impacted by it. And I think that that's an important consideration here as well.
Let me ask one last question on Russia, which has been supporting and propping up and assisting the Assad regime. Rex Tillerson, our Secretary of State, called out Russia earlier, saying they failed in their responsibility to deliver on their commitments, especially as it relates to these weapons, and either Russia has been complicit or incompetent in delivering that end of the agreement. That, to me, is a clear sign that this administration was willing to take on any consequences as it relates to both Syria and Russia. And I also think the big message here tonight and the takeaway tonight is this is a message to the world that they want to prevent any further mass casualty of civilians. And I would say the message is that's non-negotiable. Is that how you interpret that?
Well, obviously, look, I think the objective tonight was the destruction of that air base. But if you want to know who's getting a message tonight in regards to all this, I think if you're in North Korea, you see this tonight and you start to wonder whether these are people you want to be messing with. I think if you're Iran, you're starting to think about whether these are people you want to be messing with. And obviously, I think if you're Bashar al-Assad and Vladimir Putin, you realize that things have changed, and that if in fact there are things that you are doing that are against the national security interests of the United States, we're not going to spend 2 weeks looking for some letter. There's going to be action to protect our interests. That's a big change from what we've had over the last 8 years.
Senator, thank you for your time tonight. We appreciate it. Joining us now is